everybody, and welcome to Spiral Process Therapy Podcast. This is Dmitry Wolfovich, and today we have a special guest, Gavrila Abramson, AMFT, and she's going to be talking about how we evolve therapy. Hey, Gavrila.
Hi. When you said it, it's like it's such a big topic,
Mm,
and it also feels good to yeah, just to join the conversation about how we who are working in the field continue to grow what it means to be a therapist, at this point and on and on and on.
mm,
Um, but yeah, let me introduce myself a little bit more. So, as you said, I'm a associate therapist right now. And outside of the realm of therapy, even before I trained, I've been a meditation facilitator for a long time. I'm a deep meditation practitioner. Um, and I've also found myself as a teacher in trauma informed spaces. How do we offer embodiment practices that are trauma informed or meditation practices that are trauma informed? Um, and yeah, I think just like over time working with a lot of different ages and a lot of different bodies around internal process and how to meet people where they are, that really easily maps into therapy work. I think a lot of us as therapists are also bringing in somatic practices and meditation practices, and so how we kind of shape that with who we're sitting with is a big piece of my curiosity. um, and yeah, just to also acknowledge I'm an emerging musician, which is really exciting.
mm,
And yeah, and I play harmonium and I chant in ancient languages, and also feel like a self identity as a grief walker. I've been touched by death a lot in my life and feel pretty able and willing to work with people in the death realm and the grief realm.
mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
yeah. Yeah. And you and I both know that I also kind of show up as a somatic therapist. That's a specific kind of orientation that I have. And uh, yeah.
That's great. So tell us about your idea of how we can evolve therapy. So,
Okay, here we go. Um, just before we got on the call today, I was just doing a little bit of historical research. Like, I think when I was in school, I learned some of the initial developments of psychotherapy, but I wanted to kind of take a deeper look, like really where do we find the roots of psychotherapy? And they've existed for a long time, and I think it also depends what view we're taking. Like there's a lot of voices that we're not hearing from, right? A lot of like indigenous voices and ancient cultures that probably had embedded in their systems the importance of like us exploring the inner world and mental health and how that relates to physical health. Um, One of the things that I understand I'm inheriting as a psychotherapist is that the roots of psychotherapy emerged, they started to be more known, especially through um, really like physicians, like the orientation of physicians. So this is like 1700s. I was looking back. I'm just even pulling it up. There was like an Austrian physician, Franz Anton Mesmer, who was starting to bring in like hypnosis as a means to work with mental health. But he was a doctor, and following him, there's this other physician, Philippe Pinel, who was French, also 1700s, and he was kind of like the founder of psychiatry. And then further on from them, we get into like Freud, basically Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer were like some of they were the birthing place of psychoanalysis. Um,
mhm.
you
And
know, yeah.
I was just going to jump in, and maybe this is too early, but I've heard it said by many people that Siddhartha Gautama was the first psychotherapist, psychologist, psychotherapist to like explore the methods of the mind.
I mean, I love that as someone who studies the Buddhist lineage, I mean, and it makes sense. Like his as far as I understand, his main purpose was to study suffering and the end of suffering. So absolutely. I don't know if we could say he's the first. Like I'm sure there were saints and prophets and a lot of people even before him that yogic tradition, people that were studying liberation. But I love that. Yeah, I mean, he's definitely deeply affected therapy, his teachings, and especially now that the Dharma is in the West, there's many therapists and meditation practitioners that are weaving Buddhist philosophy into psychotherapy.
Right,
Yeah,
right, right.
yeah. So, I mean, I think I want to name like I'm a white Jewish woman and I have decided to study and participate in psychotherapy, which was greatly um, shaped by especially like white European men. And so, inherent in the subject of psychotherapy is also a specific lens. And I think more and more now, as we're really studying, right, like who's in the conversation, who are systems shaped for, there's this growing longing both in myself and I see it outside of myself to broaden the context that we're even exploring the realm of the inside and health. Like, what does health look like right now? What does it mean to be well in a society that's made for some of us and not others? And that also is incorporating certain wisdom and not other wisdom. So this is where this kind of like instinct is coming from of like how do we continue to evolve this pretty young subject
Hmm. Hmm.
into something that might have more depth and possibility and inclusivity.
No, I love that. What's coming to mind for me is also, I think a lot of the traditional understandings are coming to question. I think in part by sort of this, trauma informed perspective and the work of transpersonal psychology and like the spiritual emergency thing with Stan Groff, where like the whole idea of psychopathy is put into question because um what is if a person is because from a Western, like you're saying, from a Western understanding, a person who is like quote unquote psychotic is somehow ill and has some kind of organic disorder. Whereas now we're starting to understand, well, first of all, there's like traumatic events that may have been difficult, and the person is adapting in a way that appears as though they're distorted in their thinking or having some kind of hallucination and or having some spiritual process where
Right.
maybe they're experiencing some level of grandiosity or connecting to something that maybe isn't visible. And I think these are things, and I'm not sure if that's where you're going with this, but I think perhaps these are some of the things that also need to evolve our understanding
Absolutely.
of that old school mentality of mental health, right?
Right. Right. Totally. And I mean, as you say it, I think it's like you're almost shaping the container that I feel like we are exploring today, which is like what are the edges what are like the walls, the shape of the container that we've inherited as therapists, and like where do those walls need to grow and expand? And they're already happening. Like, right, diagnosis as a wall, a 50-minute session as a wall, right? There's like so I think we're in a really interesting point where psychedelic assisted therapy is becoming more and more emergent. And we're both familiar with ketamine assisted psychotherapy. For me, I feel like training as a ketamine therapist in a bubble model, right? So it's like a shorter term model. People might work with me for 6 to 9 weeks. They might spend 3 hours with me on medicine, on ketamine. For me, it started to actually like help me inquire about how we can shift the context of therapy, instead, outside of like a continual weekly 50-minute session shape that I kind of inherited as a student.
Mhm.
So I guess just to take a step back, it's like I want to acknowledge, like, as you named, it's already happening. The evolution is already happening. I mean, even you as an experiential therapist, right? This is already shifting the mode and the culture in which you invite people into the context of therapy.
Mhm.
Psychedelics, ketamine therapy is shifting the nature of what therapy can look like. There's so much wisdom happening around intergenerational trauma, intergenerational and ancestral wealth that is also in coming into, like, if I'm sitting with one person, am I just sitting with them, or am I sitting with their whole lineage and everything that shaped them? So at somatics, right, as a whole, body keeps the score was a huge benefit to the field of therapy, where we're realizing, I think, what people knew way back when, which is that we can't exclude the body, right? That the body's the keeper of a lot of the conversation and thoughts that are happening up here. So I say all of that to really kind of set this scene of our conversation around, yes, how do we evolve therapy, and also kind of taking responsibility as therapists to change and contextualize what we're offering as like a therapeutic culture. Like, what is the culture in which we invite someone in? What is allowed here? So I have a lot that we can talk about in terms of things I've been reflecting on of how we shift that culture. Um, but yeah, I think that that word feels really distinct for me, of almost like the orientation or the environment that we're creating or co-creating as a therapist with our client. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, and I think that there is still this, like you said, box, or I don't know if you used box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, just even the idea of psychotherapy has a, excuse me, has sort of a limitation because of the more societal, I don't know, more colloquial understanding of when somebody says psychotherapy, there's a certain kind of idea, right? So that's
Absolutely.
you're going to come in and you're going to sit, and I've even heard some psychotherapists or people actually working with psychedelics or journey work, I've heard people say, "Oh, I'm not going to play the psychotherapy game."
Right.
Because I think perhaps there's also inherent in that quote unquote psychotherapy game, I kind of mm, there's there's an impression that somehow the client is sick, and
Mm.
that they're vulnerable, and they're a patient, and they're sick, and I'm the expert, and and there's that kind of power dynamic too. And that's a really hard, I think you're right, that's a really hard mold to break out of.
Totally.
And I'm wondering, what are some of your ideas? Like, do you have what can we do about it? How do we break out of that mold?
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like, as you as my supervisor, you're watching me kind of in these questions, like, I can find myself feel really exhausted or sometimes really limited in that dynamic, that clients come in already expecting this like fix it mode, or um, like, even when I was kind of looking into the history of psychotherapy, what I saw a lot of is written on the internet. It's like psychotherapy, also known as talk therapy. So it's still really embedded, this idea that I'm going to come in and I'm going to just like dump, and like you're going to listen and maybe give me feedback. There's just like a lot of unconscious conditioning in that and limitations embedded in it. And I think one thing that you're helping me understand in our work together is how to really, and I'm seeing this in the relational model of therapy too, is how do we as a therapist really fully come into the room and be in relationship with the client and what we're choosing to pay attention to and prioritize within this collaborative space. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but back to your question of like, yeah, like what do we do? So I think one of the things that I was sitting with and that I am sitting with is just like just to step back and take a look at the shape of therapy. So as I mentioned before, the typical model is that we sit with people for 50 minutes, we face each other, right? So the actual shape of being together is how we are right now. We're facing each other, we're looking at each other. It's front body awareness, super front body awareness. Almost, I can experience sometimes a relational pressure in that. Like, I need to meet you, I need to talk with you or at you. So, this is just like if we took a picture, if we asked people to imagine what a therapy session would look like, it typically has that type of shape. So, one of the things that I'm starting to question, and when I say this, I'm also operating as someone who only takes private pay. So, this doesn't really talk to the systems of insurance. But even as a thought process, even for folks who are going to listen who take insurance, we can think about like what time boundaries of the therapy container even make sense. So, like I said, in deep dive work, like ketamine work, we're with people for 3 hours, right? We might need a lot of space to prepare for deepening, to come out of it. And that might be true even in non ketamine space, that we need more time to land and to transition into this relationship and transition back out of it. So, and I say that, and there's also some clients who were done in 30 minutes. And so how, right, a process happened and it's enough and it's complete. So how are we like working with the containment of time in a way that actually feels more flexible and accurate for the person that we're working with and for the work that actually wants to be done in that relationship? So that's one, it's just an inquiry I want to put out, is even just the time boundaries. Another format that we can look at that a lot of us inherit is even like an intake form. Where a lot of us just have an intake form that's been passed from supervisors or other clinics that ask these specific questions. I've started to wonder for myself, what do I actually want to know about my clients? Sure, there's certain diagnostic information I should know. There's certain things I should know about their meds. There's certain things that like ethically and legally we need to check off. But am I a therapist who's wanting to orient more relationally and find out how is this person, how are their relationships in their lives? What dynamic do they usually see happening with their romantic relationships, with their family?
Right.
What's their relationship with beings that are non-human? Do they have a connection to the ecosystem that's larger than a human-centric view?
Right.
There's ways that we can just kind of like, I almost think of it like a baker kneading dough. It's like what can be massaged even initially in some of the frames that seem so set, but they're not.
I love that. That's such a good idea. I'm already thinking I should amend my assessment document. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the questions that you ask infer something about what the therapy might look like, and
Exactly.
why have these perfunctory questions that are sanitized for some kind of hospital setting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to ask things like, oh, what's your relationship to animals? Or have you ever had a non-ordinary experience with a higher power? Or, as kooky as you'd want it to be. I mean, do you believe in extraterrestrials? I don't know if you want to ask that, but
Exactly.
something along those lines. I think that's such a really good idea. And I think that um, it's interesting. For me, it makes me think also that one of the reasons why I became a psychotherapist was that I think part of me was hungry to have some kind of legitimacy,
Mm.
to feel like I have an authority to say, oh, I can help somebody, right?
Yeah.
But now I'm feeling that there's a limitation to that. Like, oh God, now that I'm a psychotherapist, now it's kind of like, ugh, like, is that all I want to be? But it does have a certain limitation, and I've always often thought about, well, through the process model and the work that we do with spiral process, I've often tried to label it as um, Zen through experiential means,
Hmm.
or to attain Zen through experiential means is a more accurate depiction of what we do.
Hmm.
So, but it's I guess it would be hard, it's kind of hard to offer a service that says, oh, we offer a path to reaching Zen through these experiential techniques that will help you guide you through. But I think that's what you're talking about. That's like how to really fine tune and craft your service that's really aligned with what you believe, not through some industry, right?
Yeah, and actually when you say that, it makes me think about how are we as therapists working on deconditioning ourselves out of the typical ways we've learned we have to relate. I mean, this is where the relational model is incredible for therapy, because in the therapeutic relationship, we have the opportunity to invite each other into a relational honesty that rarely exists. So, even like I'm thinking about back to the intake form, for example, to be able to say, what do you not want me to ask you about? What do you not want me to know about you? What do you want to know about me? Like letting there be this
Um,
other realm of choice and possibility. It's like we're discovering together a new way of being, which in its way is like a Zen practice or a Zen teaching.
Right.
I remember your one of your teachers had taught you about like not having to come in and say, how are you? It's always fascinating to me when clients are asking me about me. What is that for? What's coming up there? Do they actually want to know me, or are they feeling like they have to make space for me, especially like a caretaker kind of archetype? So again, we get to be in this like very intimate space of like, how are we doing relationship? And what is the culture of relationship that we're co-creating in this like little time we have together? So it's so juicy to ask ourselves that question as the therapist, and also almost like have the potential to evolve what human relationship can look like, being together, what that can look like, offer experiences for folks who have never experienced relationship in a way they might want it. There's so much there. And I think I want to weave in right now also this piece about our bodies. So I said before how a lot of us have inherited this shape with therapy where we face each other. And even that, just like the time boundaries, just like the intake, I think is something worth questioning. I think I haven't done psychoanalysis, but I believe in psychoanalysis, at least from like the pictures or movies. It's like actually someone lays down, and I think the psychoanalyst is like behind them.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
You and I think in our experiential work and also somatic work, we play with changing the shapes of our bodies. But even to already question that and find out, even immediately with a client, to give them choice with their body, for us to have choice as the therapist, like what actually feels like a more comfortable dynamic for intimacy in the therapeutic space? Is it that like actually eye contact is too much and I want to just like gaze out at the wall while I talk to you? Is it that what some of the most like deep work that I've done with a therapist and in meditation is laying down, to be at rest, to support my body to be at rest, and then to be communicating from that place, from that pace, right? So there's something just about how are our bodies in space together? What permission do we have together in that? And then this brings us a little further out, but I'm starting to bring people into the redwoods for therapy. So now we're walking together. Sometimes we're sitting together. Sometimes we're just next to each other, and how all of that creates such different dynamics and possibility in how what in again the culture of therapy that we're co-creating of what this can look like.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For a while when I first started, I sat on the floor, um, because I didn't like chairs and I felt more connected to my body. But then it's funny, I found that I would often sit and I would be at the level of the client's crotch because they would be on the couch.
Yeah.
Finally, I got myself like a an ottoman, like a flat piece of furniture, and then I would sit like that. Now I've gone back to a chair, but I think that's definitely something that can be designed. And not only that, I find that it's useful to have a space big enough
Yeah.
that a person can get on the floor, or maybe a couch that's wide enough so they can curl up in a ball. Um, and then, in the relational level too, like being able to rub some kind of reparative or healing touch. Maybe if the client is rolled up in a ball with consent, you can put your hand on their back while they're crying or connecting to some kind of emotion. And that creates a whole different dynamic than just sitting around talking. I
Exactly.
think that's definitely naturally unfolding for a lot of new therapists nowadays.
Totally. And I think also it dials the volume down a little bit on this interfacing of I'm here to be fixed and you're going to fix me. When we sit like this, that is just, I think there's an embedded context in that. When we start to change how we are together and there's more fluidity and more option, there can be some easing about the productivity of therapy, where it's like, what does it mean to be together? Or how can we be together? Or how can I support you in a different way? Exactly. So
Yeah, or the lack of productivity, because sitting together like this, facing each other, implies a kind of formality, right? That you're just going to discuss things and just figure things out. Whereas if somebody's curled up in a ball, or there is a kind of congruent nature in their emotions as reflected in their body,
yeah,
and they're allowed to break down and have an experience versus having this sort of chit chat formal
right.
discussion.
Right. And even to add to that, because a lot of us are doing telehealth, I find it like Zoom immediately creates this shape. It's a really hard one to come out of. I have one client right now where and he's actually local, which is interesting, but we've decided he's asked to do phone calls. And we've talked about that of like how, in a way, the phone call instead allows a comfortable enough distance that there can be more intimacy in the therapeutic work. And what that also means is that while we're on the phone, most of the times he's out walking somewhere, and sometimes I'm like in my garden with him. And so not only are we together with a distance that actually feels like right for him, but we're also engaging with a wider ecosystem as part of our therapy. So there's just so many, I guess the one point here that feels so important is there's so many ways we can bend and reshape these structures that are so sometimes unconsciously inherited that can totally morph the way that we're relating to each other. I think I think something that I want to bring into, which has been really influenced in the ketamine assisted psychotherapy work because of the psychospiritual nature of ketamine. It has invited me as a facilitator into more intimacy with ritualization, and yeah, with ritualization in my work with clients. And it started me thinking like, so in ketamine work, it's really important, right, to have prep time, so preparation time before we're merging in with the medicine, to have integration time. I tend, when I work with people, to, in that prep time before they take the ketamine, to um, perhaps make an altar, perhaps make a prayer, maybe use tarot cards, maybe bring in scents, smells, soft things that are useful for them. That's usually a time where we're grounding, where we're finding our way into a a place of somatic resourcing, right? And so why does that only need to belong in a deep dive space? What happens? Last week I tried this. It was such a beneficial week for my therapy. I brought in a candle, and I brought in, I don't have it with me, but my like meditation bell. And I started every session with folks. I invited them to find a candle if they had one, to find something they could ring, make sound with if they had one. And we initiated the session that way. And I invited them to experience the coming into this different space to allow us to ritualize this time that we're spending together, followed by some grounding, like I said, with whatever is appropriate and aware of how they're coming in. And then, because I love full circles and cycles, we closed that way. So it's like, okay, let's ring the bell again. Let's take a moment to digest what's happened and see if there's any reflections. And then let's blow out our candle to transition back into ordinary life.
Mm-hmm. I
So
love that.
yeah, so something about like we can bring prep and integration into this holy work because it is holy work. And when it's held that way, what I found is that such deeper content came out. With one client finding, helping, she was tapping back into like her deep spiritual self-care that she used to practice with, and that's been gone. So how we come in and out of session and the environment that we create and the modalities that we bring in that benefit us, that benefit our lives, it also changes the way in which we're in relationship. It changes the way that content arises
Mm-hmm.
in even a 50-minute session.
Right. It sets a tone, right? It sets it gives an impression. I love that. Yeah, I use my gong all the time in the beginning. And I also want to go back to what you said earlier, or you mentioned it briefly about the relational realm, about how perfunctory or how formal you are in conversing, and which kind of almost inadvertently creates an altered state within itself. Because if you're sticking with how are you, oh good, good, thanks, how are you, that has a sort of normacy to it, which is the
Right.
box, right? So there's like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing. We're just checking in. And I don't like check-ins. I think check-ins are a waste of time. And I think perhaps acting uncanny as a therapist, meaning not stereotypically,
Right.
can create an environment that is outside of the box,
Right.
unique.
Right.
I think that's important, right?
Totally. And it takes, I want to honor the confidence that that takes too. Like, I know for me, when I come in acting in a different way than is normative, when I come in more of a ritualistic orientation, I have to be comfortable, or I'm practicing being comfortable shifting the tone and taking the reins in a different way. I'm inviting people into an not really an ordinary space, we're submerging a bit.
Mhm.
And so to be willing to trust that in myself and support the client in trusting that, and it's not a one size fits all. Like that ritualizing can help clients in certain ways, and some people that would be like way too far out. So of course we're always kind of like figuring out how to meet the person in front of us and still be really like authentic in our relationship. But it takes a level of confidence, I'm finding too.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to know yourself. You have to be comfortable with yourself. You have to learn how to be spontaneous.
Right. Right. Which is like intimacy with the unknown, right? We did, then we're not following a script. Then we're not doing what we normally do, which is also scary. And when clients can feel that too, and that might mean we need to resource more or check out what it's like to relate like this. So there's a lot that can come up when we start to shift out of structures that are normative. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And one of the things that's percolating as we're talking about it, as a somatic therapist, people ask me all the time, like, well, what's the difference? What are you doing? And there's the the side of being a somatic therapist, which means my work with people is going to include the body more. And there's also the way that I've been trained somatically to pay attention to things that are different than just words. So there's this, actually, this came from a client, this amazing quote by Mary Oliver. It says, attention is the beginning of devotion. Attention is the beginning of devotion. And so part of what we are invited into in building our therapeutic culture is what we're deciding as the therapist to pay attention to, which might be so different than what the client thinks is worth paying attention to. So
Right.
when I say that, that might be like back to talk therapy. Someone wants to catch me up on their life, and I might choose actually the tone of their voice or the way that their skin is turning red, or the movements that they're doing with their body. If I orient towards that rather than the story, that means I'm in a way helping us become more devoted to what else is happening in the space, which might invite us into a deeper dive. So we're colluding sometimes with what the client wants to pay attention to, and we can also hone in ourselves what is worthy of our attention. What am I devoted to paying attention to in this space? What do I think is needed? What needs my attention? And how do I support myself and the other and the client in paying attention as almost as a means of devotion, as a bow to the other seen and unseen information that's coming into the session that could lead us into doorways that are, unknown.
It's so funny when you use the word devotion. My mind naturally goes to Jesus and growing up in a Western society, probably, but it makes me think of the difference between the religion about Jesus, which is
Right.
and actually being in your heart,
Right.
experiencing it. And
Right.
there's that parallel too. So there's a kind of devotion in the immediacy of the present moment versus talking about things.
Yes, yeah. There's this this patience, the word patience in Hebrew, the direct translation, so in Hebrew it's sim lev is the way to say patience. And one of the direct translations of that is actually to give heart to. And so in a way we can, right, someone can be telling me about their anger, or we can give heart, take care of, attend to, devote ourselves to the actual anger that's emerging underneath that story.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then one actually, it's funny. Another thing to add to that is that my teachers would often say that that the heart can only speak through the present moment. It can't.
Mm.
That's the only way that the heart speaks. So if you tell somebody right now I'm sad, that's the only way that the heart speaks. If I'm talking about some that at times that I've been sad or remembering something, that's not the heart. So the heart can only speak through the present moment.
Hmm.
You're saying.
Yeah, it really touches something in me when you say that. Like, something that I've reflected on in going through a lot of grief processes is the dissonant experience I get if someone's asking me about the grief and I'm talking about it versus what my body's actually experiencing in that moment. Right. And that feeling often dissonant. Like I'm like, oh yeah, like my sister died and blah, 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 blah. But like underneath that, right, there's a whole heart and a whole body that's like with like my sister died.
Right.
And as this is like again a benefit of the therapeutic relationship is, can we attend and care for the heart and the body that's actually living through an experience rather than an idea of the experience.
Mm.
No, I think like in a way that leads me to you and I have talked about this. I'm in my own kind of birthing process about offering deep dives, so shorter term therapy with people. Ketamine assisted psychotherapy is in its nature a deep dive, and it's shorter term typically. But what I've seen from this model is the need for short term deep dives instead of the typical precedence of ongoing weekly therapy. So, for example, I have a client who's now approaching the 1 year after a breakup. That has a lot of loss and a lot of grief. In Judaism, for example, 1 year after a death is a really important initiation. It's a really important threshold. And so I'm getting curious about when someone's going through a big initiation of their life, or a big transition or a death or indecision, or I mean, it could be any pivotal moment of our lives. How do we offer containment and ritual around something like that? And it might look like a deeper dive. So for this client, for example, we were talking about what if we made a grief pilgrimage, and what if we hiked and let her really be in reflection with a witness? What happens if we make a grief altar for this process that she's been in, to really support her in moving into this threshold past the year and into her new life? So, and another example, this was such a great one. Someone who I work with who's obsessed with coffee, and he and I started to talk about, what if we had a coffee ceremony? What if, just like taking ketamine, we could set up a whole deep ritual, multi-hour ritual, where we come into contact with the like ancient knowledge of coffee and orient towards coffee in a way that we're in relationship with it, receiving the wisdom of it, tasting it, becoming alive with it. So there's these opportunities too, I think, that when we're so stuck in structure, we miss these opportunities to support people to really re-encounter the benefit of ritualizing experience or acknowledging moments of initiation in our lives.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I see this image. I don't know if there's like a Dali painting. I forgot. There's this is sort of this man kicking out of an egg, or there's like a trying to kick out of a box or something. I think that's what we're doing. And I'm noticing we have to end pretty soon, but I will also add that there is also the wisdom of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Totally,
I
totally.
think I think that as we're sort of kicking out of the box, it doesn't have to be all reformed, and
I
some of it is useful, and having ongoing relationships, long-term relationships with people has also its utility. And so, but I do think that in general, I love what you're saying, that we do want to evolve the idea.
That's right. I think about the word discipline being like to be a disciple to. So I think all of this is really the intention in talking about this, is like my own question and an invitation for those of us that are in this field and receive therapy, to be in question of like, how are we in this study? How do we study this? How do we ask? How do we inquire? Where are there ways to expand to what fits us more? And to be awake to it, to be willing to be awake to it, to actually study with it, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Wow, that was an awesome conversation. I had a lot of fun. Thanks so much, Gabriela. We'll have to maybe do another round two, or more to chat about.
Thank you. It was so fun to be here. Yeah.
All right. And just for the viewers, there's a way to contact you. You have a website. What are you called?
Connectedrootstherapy.com.
Right.
Yeah, feel free to reach out. And even if there's like just comments or curiosities, I'm happy to be part of this conversation. It totally lights me up.
Hmm. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care.